take up the basic liberties that are discussed in Chapter 4 and make today just a very general point about those, actually, because I want to lead into that by talking some more about Mill, the kind of arguments that I sketched at the last time, and I more want to draw some contrasts and some perhaps suggestions for that about how TJ does things a bit differently. Now you recall that Mill wishes it to maintain that the equal liberties that are protected by the principle of liberty, of course they're equal, and they also have priority. That's a phrase that I've been using. That is, that they regulate absolutely and without exception where the line is to be drawn between the planes of society and the planes of the individuals. It's the idea that having priority means that they regulate absolutely without exception. Now, I interpret Mill to say that those equal liberties, the ones that are protected by the principle of liberty, and others also, I think, which he discusses in the essay on the subjection of women, which I think for our purposes being included here, that those equal liberties have priority on the interpretation I was suggesting, because it is by affirming the principle of liberty, the whole absolutely and without exception, given, of course, the normal conditions of a democratic state. It's only in the present time that Mill's talking about, or in the time of his day, is by affirming that principle, which protects the equal liberties, and doing so absolutely without exception, that the permanent interests of man as a progressive being are most effectively promoted. Now, Mill doesn't, I think, have to argue that any kind of maximum is actually achieved. The point is that there is no more effective way to do it than to do this, however far short one might fall. That this principle I take to be proposed by Mill, as I went over last time, as a political principle. By that I mean it's proposed as a principle to govern the public discussion and the reasoning that is to take place that concerns legislation, or governs in the actual enactments of laws and the regulation of institutions and so forth. And it also regulates what Mill calls moral opinion, and I take that to be a form of moral pressure, you might say. It's also kind of a coercive sanction that society imposes on individuals. To then distinguish various kinds of sanctions, and among those sanctions was the moral sanction and the religious sanction, in addition to the legal sanction. And when Mill talks about moral opinion, I think he's thinking of it as, among other things, a kind of sanction that does exert a certain kind of pressure, so the principle applies to that. Now, I think Mill's view, perhaps, and I always feel a little uncertain about that, but that's what I'm going on to say, but perhaps it's best regarded as a form of indirect utilitarianism, as not rule utilitarianism, if any of you know that distinction as opposed to active utilitarianism, but kind of indirect utilitarianism, that is a view we kind of espouse by here. Now, I don't expect anybody to know that, we haven't read it that, but in any case, that's a fairly standard term, indirect utilitarianism, but it's different than the view in moral philosophy because it's applied to the principle of utility, now viewed as a political principle. So Mill is thinking of it in that context. So the idea then is that the principle of utility is not to be used as the principle of liberty is to be used in the public discussion of legislation and social policy. principle of liberty and these other perhaps companion principles, Gus and subjection of women, are to govern that. The principle of utility in Mill's sense should not apply there. I think his view is something like this: in political life, we cannot be relied upon to apply this principle correctly when we intervene in the lives of individuals, say, contrary to the idea of discarding paternalistic reasons. We always intervene in the wrong place. That is, society intervenes in the wrong place. Now, he's talking about a political principle now, and not the help that friends and members of the family must give to one another. That's another consideration. Now it's talking about as a political principle. So that we can't apply this principle correctly and without serious distortions. Also, he thinks that the principle of liberty is a public principle, when adhered to without exception, has certain desirable consequences on national character. It inculcates a notion of the person that Mill thinks is desirable from the standpoint of effectively promoting the interests of man as a progressive being, etc. And if we don't adhere to the principle of liberty without exception and allow these other considerations that to intervene and to override it, or then we don't get the benefits of this public principle of liberty and its effects on the inculcation of a certain kind of national character. So, on Mill's view, the place of the principle of utility is in our reflective philosophical thought, and it's there that we use it to understand and to comprehend the moral basis of the institutions of a democratic society in the modern age. So, properly understood, it is a central doctrine in philosophy to understand and to comprehend those institutions, but it's another thing to use it as a public political principle. So that's what I mean as the notion of indirect utilitarianism applied not within moral philosophy, but to a political principle. Now, I think that Mill, what I'm doing, you see, is a comment on the summary I gave the time before, and I will continue to do that, and we'll lead up briefly to saying some things about basic liberties at the end. Mill introduces, I think, several crucial ideas in the course of setting out his view that block the normal force of utilitarianism as an aggregated maximizing principle, which is the way in which we normally conceive of it, that is, within the philosophical traditionalist piece. And I will remind you of some of these. He says, for example, that happiness is not to be understood hedonistically, but as the successful meeting of a way of life, the living of which is suited to our nature. So we have to be successful in some way of life or mode of existence that suits our particular nature. He says also that pleasures, or at least we interpret him to do so, that pleasures are activities which involve the enjoyable exercise of our faculties, both higher and lower faculties. And next, that the distinction between the higher and the lower pleasures, which is drawn by the decided preference criterion, sort of using Mill's phrase there, corresponds to a distinction between the exercise of the higher faculties and the exercise of the lower faculties. These are all views in the current paragraphs of utilitarianism, chapter 2. I'm also assuming that Mill holds that citizens are equally capable of the higher pleasures in the form of some appropriate way of life suitable for them, That is, actually, we just have a dualism there. And that applying the decided preference or criterion of higher and lower pleasures presupposes that society has provided the opportunities and the means of education and the encouragement of the higher faculties so that people can know both kinds of pleasure and so forth and decide between modes of life. And also it presupposes that society has instituted certain social conditions which permit persons to have reason and reflect the decided preferences and to make a free choice. So the application of the criterion and the use of it presupposes that we're going to do those things. And he also believes, as I mentioned, that it is a deep psychological fact about human beings that given the social conditions presupposed in applying the decided preference of criterion, most persons will decidedly prefer a way of life that gives a preeminent place to activities which call upon the exercise of the higher faculties within the range of their endowments. Now, taken together, I think all these ideas of development, which we've have gone over at some time or other, that taken together, that these ideas support in a natural way the principle of liberty. For example, it is this principle which secures some of the essential social conditions required for the operation and putting into effect of the decided preference of criteria. Unless those conditions are instituted, there is no way to know which way of life particular individuals would decidedly prefer, and no way to know which ways of life the successful living of which would tend to maximize the well-being of this or that particular individual. Even individuals of themselves would not know. That's part of the point, and also there is no way for society to know. So it then appears to follow, or this would be the suggestion of making, that without free institutions as guaranteed by the principle of liberty, neither society nor individuals can have the information required to maximize utility. And moreover, only individuals with suitably developed faculties and living under conditions of freedom can gain and apply and follow this information. As an economist might say, I don't say that you would, it's a very brief statement, but as they might say, that just as only the decisions and actions of economic agents in a perfect market, given all the usual assumptions, and there are a lot of them, can in practice achieve an efficient allocation of resources, of economic resources, only agents that can do it in such a market under such a condition, and not some central agency operating with a computer or something. That's impossible. So Mill thinks that there is no better way for society to advance the permanent interests of men as a progressive being than to secure the rights of justice, the other rights of liberty, and the social conditions, therefore, under which the decided preference criterion can operate. Society does best, although of course it may fall short, to adhere to this course without exception. So what the philosophical doctrine of utilitarianism enables us to see, to have a role, something like enabling us to understand how these free institutions work to promote the permanent interest of man as a progressive being. Somewhat like one might say that just as economists uses the theory of general equilibrium to understand how the market arrangement and so forth, the conditions yields an efficient allocation of resources. We don't have to believe any of those things, we just say that we understand the analogy there which is being used. So you don't suppose that you can use the general theory of equilibrium actually to make particular decisions in the market. That's the point. You ask an economist who knows about the general theory of equilibrium what the stock market is going to do, he thinks you don't understand. It doesn't have anything to do with that. It just has to give an idea of how it goes, and I'm thinking that suggesting that there's similar indirect relationship in the case of milk beer. Always feel a little uncertain about this. Some year I say one thing and some another. Well, now there's a sort of transition from this to talking about basic liberties. There's a certain similarity, there's some similarity, it doesn't particularly matter how much, between Mill's principle of liberty and the first principle of justice, which secures certain basic rights and liberties. So let's abstract from these differences between these principles and ask, is there any reason for preferring one account over the other? I mean, suppose for the moment that they have the same content. Would there be any reason for preferring one over the other? Leaving aside for the moment, well, just one's true and the other isn't, that would be too easy. Are there other things about it? Well, we'll go over various points. As I have emphasized from time to time, off and on, basic political conceptions develop, I think, from some fundamental intuitive idea about how practical reason is to be understood and how the social world and our place in it is to be conceived. You have some, I think there's some very fundamental intuitive idea about all this, and we develop that and into some sort of political conception. Now, Mill starts from the fundamental idea that practical reason is always guided by some end, or ends eventually has to be subsumed under some final end. And his first principle is that we ought to act so as to arrange institutions to produce the most good. And since he believes that happiness alone is good, this comes out in Utilitarianism in chapter 4, he believes then that we put these together, that we ought to arrange institutions to produce the most happiness. Now, by contrast, and TJ1 begins with the fundamental intuitive idea that society is to be conceived as a system of fair cooperation between citizens as free and equal persons. We talked about that at the very beginning. Now, given that idea, we can ask how the fair terms of cooperation are to be ascertained. We ask that question. How are we to ascertain the fair terms? And there are a variety of ways of doing that. We could say, well, perhaps we look at natural law and so forth, other possibilities. But what one does in the case of justice and fairness is say, well, we ascertain it by an agreement reached by citizens themselves. We try to view it in that light. So it will be an agreement reached by them when they are fairly represented solely as free and equal moral persons. And since we want to find principles of political justice for the basic structure itself, we think of that as a system of cooperation in which we are born and in which we must lead a complete life. in order to get a position where we're represented fairly, as opposed to represented in some particular way qualified by our particular position in it, in order to do that we have to introduce an idea like the OP. And we use that to explain the idea of fair representation, to explain how that notion is to be understood, and we try to use it in order to say how the principles that determine the fair terms of the cooperation is to be determined. So we use then the idea of society as a system of fair cooperation, and we use the idea of the OP, and that seems to be ideas that are more congruent with the fundamental intuitive ideas of a democratic culture than the utilitarian idea of a maximizing aggregated principle. In other words, so that would be one basis of preference that we might have for going one way rather than the other. Now that does not mean that a principle, a maximizing aggregate principle, is always incorrect. And for example, I just will refer you to the argument that I suggest, well actually the criticism and assessment of Edgeworth's argument that occurs in 2J, TJ, page 170, 71, where it, in an appropriately circumscribed way, one can, in subordinate cases, employ an aggregated principle, perhaps of the utilitarian kind, but has to be suitably restricted. And I won't go with the reasons here. Why indicate that they're spelled out on 170, 71, if you're interested in that. Another point is this, is that Mill secured the equal rights and the priority as covered by the principle of liberty by blocking, at least this is what I think happens, he blocks the normal force of the principle of utility as a maximizing aggregated principle. And he does this by reformulating the idea of utility so that it is no longer a homogeneous quantity, and it is no longer identifiable as agreeable feeling, all things that we have gone over. Rather, it is identifiable only through the free choices of individuals that express the decided preferences of those individuals whose faculties have been developed and educated and who also live under institutions of freedom. That's, you redefine the notion in a way, or you recharacterize the notion in a way, so it's only under those social conditions that you have any hope of, as it were, of finding out what the greater utility is for particular individuals and for society as a whole, now under the permanent interest of man, etc. So that's behind my saying that I think he blocks the normal force of utilitarianism conceived as a maximizing aggregated principle, and that's done by in the early part, of course, of utilitarianism, chapter 2. Now, by contrast, then, in TJ, a view like that, one secures the equal rights and their priority by using a notion like the OP as a device of fair representation. Given the importance of the basic rights and liberties, and given the symmetry of the parties' situation and so on, the parties agree to the two principles of justice rather than to the principle of average utility. Actually, the case that we there discussed was where utility was understood in, say, Bentham's or Sidgwick's sense. And we went over that in handout 7 in parts C and D of that. That was first comparison that we're there to discuss. So, the point is then that, and this again is a kind of a reason for preferring doing it this way, that in justice and fairness there would be no need to block or to circumvent the normal force of a maximizing aggregated principle, or indeed I don't think there would be the need to block or to circumvent any of the normal force of the ideas and principles that are used in setting up the OP and that appear in the fundamental intuitive ideas or in their elaboration. Now I say that, I confess I haven't checked it out, but I make that somewhat hesitant assertion that there is no, you don't have to block their normal force in the same way to reinterpret them, and you actually, in a way, use them or specify them in what one would regard as a normal way, intuitively natural way. So we can interpret the OP, or the reasonable position, as a way of embedding reasonable constraints on arguments for principles of justice for basic structure. And in, I think, handout 6, why we did that. The first one, we talked about the fourth reason. It's handout 6, page 1, what I call the fourth reason for introducing the OP. Is we think of it as representing reasonable constraints that added in it, reasonable constraints on arguments for principles of justice for the basic structure. Now, these constraints are ones that we regard as reasonable in the light of our everyday convictions. That is, we say regard a certain notion of partiality is important, say in the case of justice. Well, we see that that constraint, or a constraint as opposed to express that notion, is embedded in the OP. So that is included there. And so we're simply tying together and drawing out the normal force of these everyday convictions concerning how we would reason about principles for the basic structure. So that's the idea. So that, again, is a kind of reason for preferring going this other way. In Mill's utilitarianism, as a maximizing principle, that it does not have this expected role that we mentioned before. And also, I think, related to this, that there is no attempt by Mill seriously to estimate the sums of utility. There's no real attempt to do that. Or to work out what maximizing utility would really mean in any sense that it was maximizing aggregated motion. He really doesn't attempt to do that, and I think one can see why he doesn't, because this other device really makes it unnecessary. So beyond the distinction that is this other device being the decided preference of criteria and all these other distinctions I've gone over, means he doesn't really have to do that. Beyond the distinction between higher and lower pleasures, no distinction of levels of pleasure are made, at least on the interpretation I'm giving. Interpersonal comparisons of utility play no part, and so on. The ideas and distinctions that give substance to a maximizing aggregated principle have been removed. So Mill's claim that adhering to the principle of everyday is the most effective way to advance utility, understood in his sense, seems not to have much content to it, in the sense in which it would be normally understood. Moreover, we know that this claim rests actually not on any calculations that he's made or attempt to estimate the sums, but it rests on the decided preference of criterion and the need to set up free institutions if that criterion is to be operative. So by contrast, we could say that justice for fairness is set up in a way that avoids the use of maximizing aggregated principles at the basic level, and it does not have to block or to reinterpret the normal force of the notions that it uses. That is to say, it's sort of as illustration that parties try to do the best they can for the person that each of them represents. But this is, and that's a kind of maximizing idea in the case of an individual, if you like. But it does not lead to the way it's been set up to a maximizing aggregated principles for the basic structure. And the difference principle would not be an exception to this, I don't think. And one might want to think, well, why not? And perhaps reflect about that. But I don't believe it's an exception to this. The two principles of justice include in their explicit statement analogues of Mill's essential elements of human well-being, where well-being is now understood as the well-being of citizens as free and equal persons, the developing of this idea. As such elements, and as elements of people's well-being, these two principles include the basic rights, liberties, and opportunities. These are what we have called, or I called earlier, primary goods, and they're especially important given the way in which each citizen is conceived. So the idea is that all citizens need these basic rights and liberties to maintain and to exercise their status as free and equal citizens, if we are to regard them as normally cooperating members of society and support over a complete life. So that these basic rights and so on are equally guaranteed, and for each person they're guaranteed for the same reasons, and that having then these rights would follow from the nature of each taken as an individual. So there are no maximizing aggregated notions involved at this point. And one could say that securing the basic liberties does not maximize anything, which I think is what I've been trying to say, except in the trivial sense of acting, if you like, in accordance with the best reasons, but I don't take that to be maximized. Now the aim here, and what I have been doing today, in going over these points, isn't to criticize Mill's doctrine. Then I want to emphasize what we're trying to do is to understand it. If it is correct what I have been suggesting, that he seems to arrive at this conclusions by blocking and reinterpreting the normal force of the principle of futility. That's how we would normally understand it, was understood by predecessors. If that's right, then what is simply a comparison between the two. What justice fairness does is to attempt to reach conclusions similar to Mill's, more directly, more straightforward way, by starting from the idea of society as a fair system of cooperation, etc. And for the reasons that I've just gone over, doing this may provide a more perspicuous way to secure the equal basic liberties and its priority. That is, there will be no blocking going on at all times, all stages. We can be aware of and use the notions as they were originally introduced. So those are some reasons why one might want to do one rather than the other. I'm not saying they are decisive, but the general idea with preference for doing things in a certain general manner rather than another manner. Does anything anybody would like to ask at this point? Am I making this clear at all? All right, I will proceed. What I thought I would do at the time that there remains is to say some things about the notion that appears in the first principle, that is the idea of a fully adequate scheme of basic liberties. And I want to make the same point about this, that in drawing up that scheme, that there's no maximizing aggregated notions being used. And then, again, to illustrate the same general point. Let's examine then this idea in the light of kinds of things that we have been talking about, and recall that one way to draw up a list of basic liberties is to consider which liberties are political and social conditions essential for the adequate development and full exercise of the two moral powers of citizens as free and equal persons. Here I'm referring to something that was said in handout 4, page 2, elaborated a bit there. Now, what I want to do is to introduce two what I'll call fundamental cases, and hope eventually as I go through this, it'll be clear enough what's going on. The first fundamental case is connected with the capacity for a sense of justice and concerns the application of the principles of justice to the basic structure of society and to its social policies. And the equal basic liberties of freedom of thought and the equal political liberties are to ensure the free and informed application of those principles, that is the principles of justice, to this structure and its policies by the means of the full and effective exercise of citizens' sense of justice, of course, will be guided by their intellectual powers and their knowledge and so on. So one fundamental case is the exercise of the power of the sense of justice by using the principles of justice to and applying them to the basic structure and its social policies. In order to do that, we have to institutionalize certain things to make it possible. That's the idea. We have to institutionalize equal political liberties, and that those will be given by, again, some kind of account or list. And we have to institutionalize what I'm calling freedom of thought, because that covers a lot of things. The second fundamental case is connected with the capacity for a conception of the good and concerns the application of our deliberative reason in guiding our conduct over a complete life. And here one thinks of liberty of conscience and freedom of association come in here in an analogous way that freedom of thought and equal political liberties came in the other case. So again, if you want to develop that capacity, and suppose that what the area in which it is to be applied is how to conduct ourselves over complete life, that's sort of a phrase that one uses, then again you have to institutionalize certain kinds of conditions to make that possible, and for the time being we're labeling those liberty of conscience and freedom of association. Now, supporting these basic liberties, which we have just mentioned in connection with the two fundamental cases, there would be various basic rights that would have to be protected if these liberties are to be properly guaranteed. There would be a variety of those same rights of protecting the integrity of the person, both psychologically and physically, certain rights connected with the rule of law, and so forth. And mention, for example, that when in connection with the definite principle, it said that it, in effect, if one agrees to that, regards the distribution of native endowments as a collective asset, when try to explain what that means. That it does not mean that we don't own, as it were, our native endowments, that those are protected already under the first principle by the notion of the integrity of the person and so forth. So given these distinctions, we can then specify the significance of a particular liberty or right in the following way. In which we use the notion of fundamental cases introduced to try to get a handle on the significance of a particular liberty. So we say, in an attempt to do this, that a liberty is more or less significant depending on whether it is more or less essentially involved in, or is more or less necessary institutional means to protect the full and informed exercise of the moral powers in one or both of the fundamental cases. Now, one might give an example, of course, a sort of obvious example. Might say, the weight of claims to freedom of speech are to be judged by this criterion. At least that's the idea, if one can work it out. So that some kinds of speech will not be perpetually protected, and others may even be offenses, like a libel and defamation of character of individuals will not be protected, they'll be offensive. And because the grounds there, in part, is it has no significance in regard to these two fundamental cases, and that's the view which is being suggested. It's not a significant defamation of a private character, and applying the principles of justice, say, to the basic structure, and so on. And there may be, now that, because it isn't a significant, of course, doesn't mean it can be repressed. It just means it will not have this special protection that other things will have. And even in the case of political speech, which does have that protection, normally have that protection, when it becomes incitement to imminent and lawless use of force, would not be protected as basic liberty, or under that notion. The grounds would be it is too disruptive of democratic procedures to be permitted by the rules of order, we might say, of political discussion. Now, that, of course, is just some brief indications of how one might try to tie certain claims to speech into the notion of certain cases being more or less significant, certain liberties being more or less significant insofar as they're exercising the kind of faculty that's involved in the two fundamental cases. Now, what is assumed by the notion of a fairly adequate, fully adequate scheme of equal liberties is that under reasonably favorable conditions it is possible to draw up a coherent scheme of equal basic rights that can normally allow for the full and informed exercise of the two moral powers in these two fundamental cases. And I think those are, on this view, the basic cases Of course, these liberties may conflict with one another, and presumably they will in certain circumstances, and none of them alone, of course, would be absolute. But we try to adjust them when they do conflict in particular kinds of cases, so that the more significant aspects of each basic liberty, it might say its central range of application, would be preserved intact. Now, one reason I have gone over this is these last points about how one would attempt to do this, which I've only indicated in the roughest kind of way, is that I would want to say that in doing this and trying to adjust these basic equal liberties so that they fit together in a total way, and in trying to adjust the conflicts, allowing that none of them are absolutes, the scheme as a whole, you might say, which is under normal conditions absolute. The idea is that you're not using any background maximizing notion here to do this. For example, you're not trying to